Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Tyndale House podcast. We are now getting towards the end of our series on New Testament manuscripts, and today I am joined yet again by Dirk and Nelson, who are two of our academics here at Tyndale House, part of the New Testament research team here. We'll talk a little bit more about what they do today and in some other future episodes. So welcome back, gentlemen. Good to have you with us. Now, at the end of the last episode, Dirk, you left us with a huge cliffhanger, which is something that we're not very familiar with in the world of the Tyndale House podcast. It has to be said, we've not had very many cliffhangers, but this was a good one. You said that the reformers had not paid a great deal of attention to the precise wording of the texts, and that was going to come back to bite them.
Yes.
So
what
why?
happened? What happened in the 17th century when the Roman Catholic Church started to challenge the Protestants at sort of any way they saw weaknesses, is that the argument started to be promoted that, okay, you Protestants, you say that you follow the Greek text, but which Greek text? Because here we have all the manuscripts preserved in our libraries, in our monasteries, and the wording differs. So what you see in the 17th century is that there were several collections of variant readings published. Walton had a whole volume in his Polyglot. Field in 1675 had a whole section in his Greek New Testament with variant readings, uncatalogued, just variant reading after variant reading, but giving credence to the claim that, well, actually, you do need church authority to give you the true text, as the Roman Catholic Church was claiming, and you Protestant you think that everyone can do that on his own. Well, it's clearly impossible. So that was the vulnerability that was laid bare. And from that moment on, the issue of the precise wording became indeed something the Protestant Church, but Catholic scholars did so as well, seriously had to come to grips with.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fair criticism, isn't it, to say how do you know and how can you put this into the hands of the ordinary people when there are all these variants? So did the Catholic Church at that point try to come up with an answer to that, or was it simply you should be going back to the Vulgate?
Well, the argument more or less theologically is actually you need the church authority.
Yeah.
To basically determine what's proper. Because when you come to think about it, the Vulgate has, when it comes to its exact wording, exactly the same problem as the Greek text has.
Yeah, right, okay.
So the solution, then Protestants would say, is not to give the authority to the church, but to apply good thought to the problem and see what we can come up with. And so you see in the beginning of the 18th century, so 1730s, German scholar Bengel started to address the issue of that whole mass of textual variant after textual variant, etc.
Was he the first one to do that?
He was the first one to start organizing the whole thing, because Bengel noticed that certain manuscripts tend to group together in the form of the text they had. So Bengel say, well, you can actually think about all those manuscripts as, well, some of them form siblings, others are part of the same family, and you can sort of make the groups bigger and bigger to ultimately divide them in various nations. So his was a sort of geographical way of looking at it. And that way, you could organize the evidence much better. And you could see that one of the nations he had in mind, the Constantinopolitan, that is actually the text of the Middle Ages, but there is also an older text before that, which is clearly recognizable.
So how did this help help things? I mean, he's cataloguing things, he's ordering things. How did that help answer the question?
It was the first attempt to start thinking about the history of the text as something that you could reconstruct, something that you could follow through the manuscripts. And once you know the history of a text, then of course that old notion of back to the origin becomes an easier one to maintain.
Yeah. Okay. When it comes to reconstructing the history, say, or the supposed reconstruction of the history of an Old Testament text, the history of the construction of Amos, for example, there have been various speculations that there are, Hans Walter Wolff, for example, suggests there are 6 cycles of editorial, and it's so speculative. Is reconstructing the history of these manuscripts as speculative as reconstructing the history of how a text came to be composed in the Old Testament, which is very speculative most of the time?
I think methodologically it is dissimilar in the sense of when you look at the history of the wording of the text, you look at actual instances where texts are differ. So we don't have to hypothesize a sort of a reading that does not exist, at least not normally, but at least we can work with the actual data and try to put them in a certain order. It doesn't make it any less complicated, though. Because we know we have plenty of missing links. Sure. And as happens with the New Testament tradition is sometimes described as contaminated, which is it's a bit of an ugly term, but what it means is that not every textual variant comes to us from parent to child to grandchild, etc. But sometimes textual variants skip families. They move sideways simply because people are comparing one manuscript with another manuscript from a different family.
Yeah, right. And so people like Bangel, they were able to know what era the manuscripts came from, and so when he's reconstructing his histories, he is able to say, this is before this, and this is before this, and therefore this is the development of how we get to these families of manuscripts.
Well, Bangel had a first go at it. Griesbach, a little bit later in the same century, his reasoning was slightly more sophisticated, but clearly, he was building on stuff that Bangel did. Griesbach basically said that, yes, we can distinguish roughly 3 groups. One of them is clearly later, because the oldest evidence he saw was in citations from John Chrysostom, from the end of the 4th century. Right. That was sort of the earliest of that particular group. And when it comes to actual manuscripts, all the manuscripts come from later, from after that. And before sort of Chrysostom, he could see 2 different groups, a common one, or a rather vulgar one, and a very tightly grammatically controlled.
Right. So Bangel 1730s, Griesbach, did you say?
1760s.
Okay, yeah. And so that this is a process then of ordering, of grouping, cataloguing, looking at the historical development. How does that begin to help this whole process of trying to decide what the original text was?
One of the problems that you get with, let's say, the New Testament versus other classical literature is just the number of manuscripts that have survived. I mean, now, obviously, far more than what they had in the 17th or 18th, but if you've just got less than 10, your task is not as difficult as if you have 100 or 1,000 manuscripts to work with. With rare exception, I mean, there's not many human beings that can sort of keep all that data in their head with so many different manuscripts and so many different readings. And so by dividing up manuscripts into these these groups or these families, and then sort of saying that, okay, this group of, 100 manuscripts, or, today we sort of put thousands of manuscripts into sort of the Byzantine group. If we can say that this group of hundreds or thousands of manuscripts comes from a later period, seems to have been tightly revised by church authority to keep some uniformity to it. I mean, essentially what it allows us to do is basically, of course, there are those who would disagree with this move, but basically take this big group of a lot of manuscripts and you can conclude based on studying its characteristics internally, its place in history, who quotes it, so that you can give a date that, okay, this large group of manuscripts from a later period is not going to help us. So the lectionaries would be in this group too. And the lectionaries, I mean, we've got thousands now. We can basically sort of set those aside. There are a few later minuscule manuscripts that are of good quality that can help us, but basically this grouping into families allows us to kind of make the large amount of manuscripts that we have to work with, make it more manageable.
Right. And these families are what some people call text types. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah.
The term has come a little bit out of favor for all sorts of reasons. Yeah. But yes, you're right.
And it's best to think of them as a kind of a cluster, collection of similar, related manuscripts rather than a definitive. These are the features of it. Yeah. Sorry, you were going to say something.
Yes. So we're talking now about organizing the evidence, kind of making sense of it, be able to come to grips with it. At the same time, throughout the 18th century, people started to think about the methodology of how to do textual criticism. What is your reason for saying that reading A is earlier than reading B?
Yeah, right.
Example? And it was actually sort of a kind of a German immigrant into the Netherlands, so that was rather flexible at those time. Gerhard von Maastricht. He was the first one in 1711 who published a Greek New Testament with 35 canons of textual criticism at the beginning. So in which he had made an attempt to give some sort of rules of thumb to be able to choose between variant readings. Some of those canons are a bit too simple to be useful. So one of them says, most manuscripts tend to add something. And then the next canon is, most manuscripts tend to lose something. So that doesn't really give you a practical tool but at least it describes indeed what's happening. I mean, manuscripts add, manuscripts omit, and that happened. But some of the rules he had are still actually survive one way or the other, and comes down to which reading explains best how the other reading comes into being.
Right.
And then you know the origin of the other. And that goes back to thinking about the theory of textual criticism in the 18th century.
Yeah. So we keep talking about textual criticism, but now really this is what textual criticism is, isn't it? It's figuring out what the text should say. Is that right? I mean,
yes.
Is that ultra simplistic?
Almost too simplistic. Let's grant you.
That's my job here, is to be simplistic. Then
I would rather say then what the text say is what the exact wording of the text is.
Right.
Because quite often differences in wording do not really affect the overall text.
Right. Yeah.
So that's this slight nuance I would like to add to your brilliant simplistic summary.
Well, it's always nice to be brilliant and simplistic. So what does a text critic do then in this process? What are the principles that a contemporary text critic works with? Presumably he's not using this guy from Maastricht, not using most of his principles, but you say some of them are still abiding. How does a textual critic go about his or her work?
Well, that has been a matter of huge debate in modern times as well. So there are people who want to go strict for their preferred manuscript. So you look at all the evidence and you find one manuscript that you think is the best manuscript of the best family, of the best text type, and let's follow that unless we have very good reason not to do it. That is roughly a summary of the theory of Westcott and Hort in the 19th century.
Yeah, we talked about 2 episodes ago.
That's right. Then there are others who say, well, actually, we should give preference to what we think on a case-by-case basis has the best explanation for its origin. So then you become a very radical in the choices you are making, because you forget everything that you made in all your opinions on the previous textual variant, but for every unit you start afresh. What explains best how it came into being, irrespective of the external evidence of manuscripts?
Right.
And then, of course, you try to balance the various approaches. One of the things we have tried to do in the Tyndale House Greek New Testament is giving particular attention to studying just copying process, in the sense of what goes wrong when you copy a text, what goes right when you copy a text. And if you study that what goes wrong and in what sort of proportions it goes wrong, then you have good tools available to tackle the majority of textual variants.
Okay, we talked a little bit about some of the things that go wrong in one of the earlier episodes, probably when we were talking about the different kinds of manuscripts and the differences between them. But because people might not remember, what kinds of things do go wrong? What are you looking out for?
So when it comes to a scribe copying, I mean, you sort of have to put yourself in their seat and in their shoes. What sort of things can go? I mean, just even in the modern times, when you think about copying a quote, let's say out of a book, and you're typing it up, and you go back and look, and you realize, I messed this up or messed that up. And actually, one of the copying errors that happens quite frequently, and I sort of got a big lesson in this, was when I was taking a course on the Greek Old Testament, and our professor had us basically, you look at a manuscript and then first you transcribe it, right? So you write the letters or the words that you see in the manuscript, and then you translate it after that. And we were transcribing, I think it was a papyrus of Psalm 37 or something like that. And in that psalm, there's this sort of line that ends with David, and then there's another line of text that also ends with David. And this was a final exam, right? So it's not like I was sleepy or being lazy or something like that day. I was paying attention, trying to do the best that I could to transcribe this papyrus. And I basically just skipped an entire line. I went from David to David and missed everything in between. And even with checking my work and everything like that, I still didn't catch it. But my professor did catch it, and he wrote in the margin, parablepsis with exclamation marks. And because, the parablepsis is basically where your eye skips, from, let's say there's a repeated word like David to David, and your eye skips everything in between, and it falls out. So you get a shorter text, right? But it falls out because your eye has skipped. Thankfully, he did not deduct points from the exam, even though I had basically missed an entire line. So he technically should have, but he recognized, and I recognized, and I learned that, okay, this is easier to happen than I think some scholars sort of shy away from. They prefer the shorter text, right? So they'll shy away from parablepsis as a way of saying, okay, if that whole line dropped out because of a skip of the eye, then then you should go with the longer text. But there are text critics who they really like to go with the shorter reading, and so they've maybe ignored this principle of eye skipping. Right. But that was a big lesson to me of how how easy that can happen, and even. I think the bigger thing is the fact that it went uncorrected, right? Because a lot of times the scribe would go back and realize, okay, I made this mistake. But even if you're attentive and careful, it could still go uncorrected.
Huh. Yeah, wow. That's a very good lesson, isn't it? My understanding is that one of the principles that used to be kind of standard is always go for the harder reading. So that would be an example of where the bit, a reading that, or a manuscript that didn't miss the stuff out would be, how does that work out with those kinds of issues with parablepsis and the other mistakes? Is it the case that the harder one is always the more difficult? I can't work out whether the bit that misses stuff out or the bit that includes it would be harder in your case, but how does that work as a principle?
Well, if you would apply that principle consistently, you probably end up with an unintelligible text because you always go for the hardest reading. So that is one restriction. The second restriction is harder according to what? Is it harder in my limited understanding of Greek grammar? Is it harder in my limited understanding of Paul's logic, etc.? There's a good example of this in Mark 1:41, where the text says, though in the context of the healing of a man in the synagogue, that Jesus stretched out his hand and touches him. And there is a construction that says, Jesus filled with mercy, and then does everything. The textual variant says, Jesus being angry stretched out his hand. So it's Mark 1:41. Now, the harder reading, according to probably most Western Christians, is the Jesus being angry. Because we all have a little bit that impression of Jesus, soft, gentle, etc. So Jesus being angry is probably the harder reading and therefore the more original one.
Right.
Which is actually what the most recent iteration of the NIV went with. All other English translations still have Jesus filled with mercy.
Right.
And rightfully so, I think. Because here, the harder reading may perhaps not be as hard for 1st century or 3rd, 4th century Christians, where the whole notion of Jesus descending from heaven with no flaming sword, executing vengeance on the enemies of the people of God, is much more a live notion in the context of persecution, etc., than in the sort of godly Western context. So their modern kind of preconceptions may actually interfere with the notion of what is really harder.
Why is there an assumption that scribes should make things simpler anyway? I mean, what isn't that assuming that the scribes are deliberately changing things because they're finding something a little too challenging, and therefore we'll go for compassion because we'll go for anger because that's easier for us than to put in that compassion? Why should that even be going on?
Well, if you copy a text which is going to serve for the public reading in the church, then a sentence that has a rather stuttering word order is more likely to be copied or more likely to be remembered in a smoother version.
Okay.
And therefore you get the sort of smoother word order or the smoother expression. Also because it requires less energy to retain. And our brains tend to be economical in the sense of remember things in the shape that it is easiest to remember.
Right.
So that is probably a reason why, indeed, some of the harder things in the language tend to be smoothed out.
Okay, so it's not that it's theologically motivated; it's just that it's easier.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So you're balancing some of these different kinds of questions. What kind of mistakes are scribes likely to make? What else do you do in this process of textual criticism? How do you make other decisions? And how has that changed over time as well? Presumably, it's a developing thing all the time.
So another thing a textual critic would do is to look at the manuscript evidence itself and look at the date of the manuscript, look at sort of if you study the manuscript, a large amount of its text to see, just generally how good or bad this scribe was. Were they constantly making mistakes that needed to be corrected, or did they do a fairly good job of copying the text? So some scribal habits of certain manuscripts, the date of the manuscript, then which sort of group the manuscript belongs. So at least with the Tyndale House edition, tried to give preference to the manuscripts from the earliest period, so basically up to about the 5th or the 6th century. There's not that many manuscripts from that time period, but one of the principles that was used was basically, okay, if we have a reading that's well attested in the first 5 centuries, is there a reason that we should not go with the earliest text? Is there some reason that we should modify that earliest text? And in most cases, the Tyndale House edition was able to reconstruct a text it's well attested in the first 5 to 6 centuries. So not everyone would sort of go with that approach, although maybe in theory they wouldn't go with that approach, but in practice they really do go with the earliest manuscripts. But that's something that here at Tyndale House, and I think others would consciously do, is to sort of, you look at certain manuscripts and they're clearly, this is a naughty thing to say, but we sort of do have our preferred manuscripts, even if we're not sort of like with your children, right? Are you not supposed to have a favorite child? But most text critics do sort of have a favorite or a couple favorite manuscripts. In this case, Tyndale House have tried to make that favorite group the early group, right? So not just sort of, Codex Sinaiticus or Vatican. It's just that early group. Can we reconstruct that early group? So that would be sort of one of the main guiding principles, is to look at the age of the manuscripts and prefer the earlier ones over. Yeah. Not to say that the later manuscripts can't preserve an original reading, but just as a general rule of thumb, to go with the earliest, oldest evidence.
Yeah. Okay. And how does that compare with the Nestle Aland, which is the standard Greek text, isn't it, that everybody uses when they're...
We're talking about history still, I believe. So the first edition of the Nestle Aland was not published under the Nestle Aland label then. Was actually published anonymously, in a sense, by the German Bible Society. It was a combination of 3 existing Greek New Testaments that had been published. The one by Tischendorf, Westcott and Horde and Weymouth. And they basically took a majority vote for each of them. And that was how the first editions of the Nestle Aland were published.
Right.
Now, its use was in its sort of apparatus at the bottom, where it says which editions followed which reading. Then from the 5th to the 13th edition, some of the sources were changed. And then nothing changed from the 13th up to the 25th edition, except that it gave the evidence of a lot of manuscripts. Right. It's only in the 26th editions, published in 1978, I believe, that a thoroughly new text based on the best manuscript, the best scholarship, sort of, was published. So it is a relatively recent independent text, even though for most of the 20th century, scholars would use it and accept it as it is.
Okay, right. We'll have a whole episode on the Tyndale House Greek New Testament coming up. But what's the essential difference then between the two? You just taken, because you've gone back to square one and first principles with these early manuscripts? Or
yes, it's unashamedly preferring early manuscripts. It is unashamedly trying to seek explanations in the simple things that go wrong in copying. And it is unashamedly trying to follow the earliest evidence, even in things such as spelling. So in the Tyndale House Greek New Testament, you will find inconsistent spelling of words simply because that is where the evidence leads us. So we are less heavy on editorial input in that way.
Good. Well, there's an awful lot more to talk about there, but I think time is out, so we'd better draw things to a close there. Draw stumps, as we say in the cricketing world. Not that that's a metaphor that's going to work for my Dutch and American friends, but never mind. I'm happy to draw stumps on this one. But there's a lot of stuff we haven't talked about that we were planning to in this episode, so we'll carry on with this discussion next time. We'll be talking about, particularly about how just so much more stuff became available over the last 100 years or so. And that has changed the whole world of textual criticism, hasn't it? So there's another cliffhanger for you. 2 cliffhangers in a row on the Tyndale House podcast. Come back next time and find out all about that mushrooming of material and how that impacted the world of textual criticism. So thank you, Dirk. And thank you, Nelson. Thank you for joining us. Please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts so that other people get to know about us. Tell your friends, introduce it to your dog, anything that grows the audience. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.